The summer air in the Nevada highlands was harsh, thin, sharp, and full of the coppery scent of dust and wild things. Sunset bled across the horizon in streaks of orange and purple, but there was no peace in the shadows tonight. Out near the old juniper grove, where broken branches made strange, finger-like shapes against the darkening sky, a young foal stood alone, barely more than a shadow himself, legs trembling, head tossing in blind panic. He had lost his mother that morning. The world had changed in an instant, the gentle warmth of her breath gone, the only comfort he'd ever known stolen by something fierce and invisible. A mountain lion, maybe, or a sudden fever. The herd had kept moving, pulled by some instinct to survive, but the foal couldn't keep up. By nightfall, he was stranded, small and silent, on the edge of the open range. The wolves found him first. 3, then 5, then a half dozen. They moved with hunger and calculation, eyes catching the last glimmers of sunlight as they fanned out around the helpless colt. Their leader, a gray alpha with a scar down one eye, licked his chops and advanced, hackles raised. For a moment, time seemed to pause. The foal's knees buckled. He let out a cry, shrill, desperate, echoing in the open plain. Nature, everyone said, had its way of sorting the strong from the weak, the lucky from the unlucky. Tonight, nature seemed ready to make its choice. But then, thunder. Not in the sky, but pounding across the ground. Hoofbeats, wild and fast, growing louder and closer until the very earth seemed to tremble. Out of the dusk he came, a massive black stallion, coat slick as midnight, mane flying like a battle flag. His eyes flashed with defiance, and every muscle seemed coiled with violence and purpose. The wolves hesitated, uncertain for just an instant, but the stallion didn't give them time to reconsider. He barreled straight into the ring, hooves striking the earth with explosive power. Dust flew in every direction. The stallion reared, his silhouette etched against the deep red sky, and slammed his forelegs down between the wolves and the foal. The lead wolf darted in, snapping at his flank, but the stallion spun with breathtaking speed, kicking out and sending the wolf tumbling backward. Chaos erupted, snarling, yipping. The wolves tried to regroup, but the stallion was a force of nature. He didn't know the foal. He had no reason, no bond of blood or herd to risk his life, and yet he fought as if the foal were his own flesh. He stomped, slashed, and charged, scattering the pack, sending them running for the safety of the sagebrush. Only the scarred alpha lingered, teeth bared, but the stallion met his gaze and snorted, a sound that shook the night. The wolf turned and slunk away, humiliated. Silence fell. The dust hung in the air, and the foal, stunned, stared up at his savior. The stallion stood over him, breathing hard, every inch the wild legend locals whispered about, the infamous Black Comet. He lowered his head, nostrils flaring, and for a second it seemed he might walk away, leave the foal to whatever came next. But Comet stayed. He nudged the foal gently, urging him to his feet, then circled him, inspecting for wounds. Satisfied, he stepped back and gave a soft, deep nicker, an invitation or maybe a command. The foal, still shaking, pressed close to Comet's side. High above, hidden behind the low branches of a pinyon pine, another set of eyes watched everything, eyes sharp with intelligence, rimmed with worry. Charlotte Monroe, not long out of ranger school, crouched in the brush, her tranquilizer rifle gripped tight. She'd been tracking Black Comet for weeks, assigned to capture the stallion that had made fools of every agent before her. She'd heard tales of his speed, his cunning, the way he led entire herds away from danger like a phantom. She'd thought he was just an animal. Smart, yes, but still just an animal. But tonight, nothing in her training had prepared her for this. She'd seen wild horses defend their own foals, sure. But never a stranger. Never like this. She watched as Comet stood protectively over the orphan, saw the way he kept one eye on the darkness, nostrils twitching for any sign of danger. The foal, half in shock, tried to nurse on Comet's shoulder. Comet let him for a moment before nudging him upright again. Charlotte's hands shook. Her rifle sight was lined up perfectly. She could bring Comet down now, claim the capture, maybe even get her own section in the local paper. But something in her chest clenched. This wasn't a monster. or a myth. This was something different, something that deserved another chance. She lowered the rifle. Her boots dug deeper into the dirt. The wind changed, carrying her scent down into the clearing, but Comet didn't flinch. He just kept watch over the foal, eyes burning with a kind of wild dignity that made Charlotte's heart race. Night thickened. Somewhere, a coyote yipped. Charlotte stayed hidden, torn between duty and the new electric certainty that she was witnessing something rare. A choice that ran deeper than blood or instinct. A choice that might change everything she thought she knew about wildness, and maybe about herself. The Mustang stood guard until the moon rose, and the wolves never came back. The foal, exhausted, finally curled at Comet's feet. And high above, Charlotte wiped her eyes and realized that the world was wilder, kinder, and infinitely more complicated than anyone back at headquarters would ever believe. Charlotte Monroe sat hunched beneath the broad branches of the ancient pine long after the moon had risen, her tranquilizer rifle growing heavier in her arms with each passing minute. She watched Black Comet and the Orphaned Foal from her hidden post, every instinct in her body warring with every lesson drilled into her during ranger school. She was supposed to be the one in control, the scientist in the field, the federal agent bringing order to the untamed. Instead, she felt more like a ghost, unseen, irrelevant, humbled by the raw, unfiltered power of nature playing out before her. The stallion and the foal made a strange pair in the silvered night. Comet barely slept, his head lifting at every sound, ears pricked, muscles coiled and ready. The foal would sometimes jerk awake, a frightened whinny escaping him, and Comet would press his flank close, steady and silent, until the foal's tremors stilled. The land itself seemed to settle around them, the threat of wolves fading into the distance. In that hushed hour before dawn, Charlotte felt as if she were witnessing something sacred, something that had nothing to do with human definitions of family, protection, or heroism. Her radio crackled at her belt, shattering the spell. Unit 3, status check. Monroe, do you copy? The voice was sharp, impersonal, belonging to a supervisor miles away who had never once laid eyes on Black Comet, let alone stood in the same patch of wild dust. Charlotte hesitated, thumb hovering over the transmitter. Her eyes never left Comet. For weeks, her mission had been clear: tranquilize, tag, and transport. Bring order to chaos. Put a checkmark next to Black Comet's name on a list. But now, she couldn't shake what she'd seen. The moment Comet risked everything for a stranger's foal, the defiance in those wild, intelligent eyes. She pressed the radio. Unit 3, all clear, she lied, her voice steady. Continuing observation. Over. She switched the device off, and with shaking fingers disabled her GPS tracker, slipping it beneath a rock so her location would appear static. If the office wanted her position, they'd find it right where she'd last checked in. The wild, for a little while, would keep its secrets. As dawn painted the sky with a promise of heat, Charlotte followed at a careful distance, keeping downwind, her boots light in the sage. She watched as Comet led the foal down into a sheltered arroyo where the last of spring's water still pooled. The foal drank eagerly, splashing with awkward, long-legged enthusiasm. Comet drank too, but with measured dignity, ever watchful. Charlotte wondered about the Mustang's story. Had he lost foals of his own? Had he ever belonged to a herd? Or had he always been the ghostly outcast the old cowhands whispered about? The locals called him a legend, an outlaw, the devil in horse's skin. But what kind of devil risked his life for another's offspring, then stood vigilant through the long, cold hours of night? When the herd appeared on the distant ridge, Comet's old band, moving with the ease of those who still had mothers to guide their steps, Comet stood his ground. He let them pass by, made no effort to rejoin, though Charlotte could see his longing. The foal watched too, ears flickering, body half tense to run after them. Comet blocked his path with a gentle nudge, steering him back to the shadowed safety of the gully. Charlotte found herself rooting for them, heart pounding with every movement. She became part of the landscape, crawling on her belly behind rocks and juniper, her camouflage blending with the earth. Days passed in a blur of sunrises and star-filled nights. She watched Comet teach the foal to move quietly, to use the wind, to sniff the air for traces of humans and wolves. The stallion never coddled. He tested, challenged, and waited, eyes never betraying fear even when the foal stumbled or wandered off. At dusk one evening, Charlotte watched a lesson unfold. The foal, curious, wandered too far from shelter, following a flock of birds. Comet let him go, didn't call him back. When the foal finally realized he was alone, panic set in, his whinny rising, echoing off canyon walls. Charlotte tensed, ready to intervene, but Comet simply stood and waited, powerful and unmoved. Only when the foal returned, shaken but wiser, did Comet greet him with a deep nicker, head lowered in acceptance. Charlotte realized she was witnessing something rare, a kind of love, not driven by biology, but by choice. Comet could have left the foal to fend for himself, could have chased after his old herd, or run deeper into the canyons where no ranger could ever follow. Instead, he chose the burden of care, the risk of danger, the slow, patient teaching of survival. It was the first time Charlotte had seen true fatherhood not as instinct, but as an act of will. One morning, Charlotte nearly exposed herself. She slipped on a patch of loose shale, her boots skidding on rock. The sound echoed across the arroyo. Comet's head shot up, ears forward, body poised to bolt. The foal pressed close to his side. Charlotte held her breath, unmoving, heart thudding. After a tense pause, Comet snorted, pawed the ground, then herded the foal further down the draw, away from the threat. Charlotte knew she was pushing her luck. Her food was running low, her radio silent. She left marks in her notebook, sketches, observations, a running record of Comet's behavior. She wondered how she'd ever explain this to her supervisor, to anyone. She'd come to subdue a wild horse, but now she was the one being changed. Her beliefs, her sense of duty, all called into question by a creature who didn't fit any of the boxes the agency provided. One night, as the coyotes called and the wind howled through the trees, Charlotte stared up at the stars, her resolve hardening. She was done playing by rules that didn't account for the wild's capacity for choice. She was done treating living beings as problems to be solved. In the cold, silent dark, Charlotte swore an oath to herself. She would protect Comet and the foal, even if it cost her her job, her reputation, her carefully ordered life. Some missions, she realized, were worth abandoning for something greater. The days that followed were quieter, filled not with the chaos of pursuit, but with the subtle, almost sacred routines of survival. For Charlotte, each morning now began before dawn, waking to the chill of the high desert, drawing her knees close beneath her ranger jacket, as she listened to the sounds of a world not made for humans. Somewhere out in the distance, coyotes yipped at the fading moon. Closer, the wind shivered through sagebrush, carrying with it the scents of horse sweat and wild grasses. Black Comet had settled into a pattern. He led the foal from one hidden patch of grass to the next, always careful to keep the little one out of the open. Charlotte followed, careful to keep her distance, learning to move as quietly as the stallion she was now shadowing. She found herself watching him with a kind of awe, not just the way he moved, but the choices he made, the patience he showed. Each day, Comet taught the foal something new. One afternoon, as a hot breeze rippled over the valley, Charlotte watched the foal, still unsteady on his legs, try to chase a grasshopper and tumble headfirst into a patch of soft dirt. For a moment, the colt struggled, legs kicking, head thrown back in frustration. Charlotte felt her own hands tense, instinctively wanting to rush forward and help. But Comet simply stood nearby, unbothered, his head lowered, eyes steady. He waited. He let the foal flail, whimper, and finally, with a snort of determination, right himself and stand. Only then did Comet step forward, brushing his muzzle gently against the foal's mane. Charlotte scribbled in her notebook, her fingers almost trembling with the realization of what she was witnessing. This wasn't just survival. This was teaching. Comet wasn't reacting on instinct alone. He was making a choice to let the foal learn pain and recovery, fear and courage. It was a lesson in independence, a slow shaping of spirit that went far beyond what any field manual described. Throughout the week, Charlotte witnessed dozens of moments like this, each one quietly profound. When the wind shifted and brought with it the distant tang of engine oil, Comet would freeze, his nostrils flaring. He'd glance at the foal, then at the horizon, and the pair would melt into the shadows, disappearing into gullies or behind thick stands of rabbit brush. The foal learned to follow, to crouch low, to watch Comet's ears for silent signals. One morning, Charlotte found herself barely breathing as she watched a herd of deer move nearby. Silent and alert, the foal, entranced by their presence, took a tentative step forward, but Comet shifted his weight, blocking the way. The message was clear: safety first, curiosity second. And so the foal watched, waited, and learned. In the quieter moments, the desert itself became a kind of teacher. The days were hot, the nights bitter cold. Water had to be found, not just stumbled upon. Charlotte watched as Comet led the foal to dig at the base of a dry stream bed, unearthing a hidden pocket of moisture beneath the cracked earth. She saw how the stallion sampled plants before allowing the foal to graze, how he always circled twice before allowing rest, scanning for threats both seen and unseen. All the while, Charlotte remained a silent observer, blending into the background, unwilling to break the fragile trust forming between herself and the wild. Her clothes grew dustier, her face tanned and drawn. She found herself eating less, rationing her supplies, unwilling to make noise or draw attention. She felt herself changing, her senses sharper, her priorities shifting. She was no longer just a ranger on assignment. She was a student of survival, a witness to something ancient and honest. But the days were not without tension. One afternoon, storm clouds began to build in the west, churning over the mountain ridges with a promise of rain and wind. Comet grew restless, leading the foal to higher ground, away from the flash flood risks of the arroyos. Charlotte struggled to keep pace, stumbling over loose rocks, her breath ragged in the thinning air. The foal faltered, lagging behind, but Comet kept moving, forcing the little one to push through exhaustion and fear. Only when they reached a safe plateau did Comet slow, letting the foal collapse in a heap. Charlotte, hidden behind a stand of piñon, wiped sweat from her brow, marveling at the stallion's relentless will. That evening, as the first drops of rain began to fall, Charlotte watched Comet stand over the foal, his body shielding the colt from the wind. There was no drama, no grand gesture, just a silent act of care, a refusal to let the little one face the storm alone. In that moment, Charlotte understood. Protection wasn't always about comfort. Sometimes it was about allowing hardship, knowing when to intervene and when to stand aside. It was about trust, hard-earned and never guaranteed. As the storm passed and the desert bloomed with the scent of wet sage, Charlotte found herself reflecting on her own childhood. Her father, a quiet man with hands rough from years of work, had believed in letting her learn the hard way. He'd taught her to ride, to fix a fence, to fall and get up again. She'd resented it at times, but now, watching Comet and the foal, she saw the wisdom in those lessons. Strength wasn't given, it was earned, forged in the quiet days when no one was watching. One night, Charlotte was roused by the sound of laughter, not her own, but a memory, echoing in the dark. She realized she was smiling for the first time in weeks. She was exhausted, hungry, dirty, and yet she felt more alive than she had in years. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. As dawn crept across the desert, painting everything in gold and pink, Charlotte made a promise to herself. She would protect this fragile bubble of wildness for as long as she could. She would learn and watch and wait, just as Comet did. The world was still dangerous. Threats still lingered on the horizon. But for now, for this quiet stretch of days, a foal learned to stand on his own, and a ranger remembered what it meant to truly care. It was late in the afternoon when the first real silence settled over the wild Nevada landscape. The sky had shifted from the furious blue of midday to a gentle wash of amber and lavender, the air cooling with the promise of evening. Out on the rim of the basin, Black Comet grazed quietly, his muscles finally at rest. The foal, who had grown stronger and a little braver each day, kept close by, nosing the sweet tufts of grass and darting nervous glances at every new sound. They looked, for the first time, like a family. Charlotte lingered at the edge of a ragged grove, crouched in the shadows of a wind-stunted juniper, her notebook forgotten in her lap. Her senses were tuned to every movement, every shift of the wind. But for the first time since she'd abandoned her mission, she felt the edge of her anxiety soften. She was an outsider, but less so now. Days of silent observation had made her part of this hidden world, if only in the margins. Her stomach rumbled, a reminder that she hadn't eaten a real meal in days. She reached into her pack, pulling out a battered protein bar, and took small, careful bites, not wanting to disturb the scene. She watched as Comet wandered a little farther away, trusting the safety of the dusk. The foal, left for a moment, wandered curiously closer to where Charlotte hid. It happened so quietly that Charlotte hardly realized what was unfolding. The foal paused just a few yards away, his oversized eyes reflecting the fading gold of the sky. He sniffed the air, then stepped forward, tentative but without fear. Charlotte held her breath. She resisted the urge to move, to speak, even to reach for her camera. She simply watched, letting the moment bloom in its own time. The foal's steps were careful, each hoof placed gingerly as if he were walking on a surface that might suddenly give way. He paused just at the tip of her boot, lowering his head, his soft muzzle trembling with curiosity. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other, wild and human. Two creatures with no real reason to trust, yet drawn together by the quiet of dusk. And then, so gentle it almost broke her heart, the foal licked the dust from the toe of her boot. The sensation was barely more than a whisper, but to Charlotte, it felt like thunder. She blinked back tears, afraid to move or speak, letting the connection hang in the air as long as it dared. She wanted to say something, to reach out and comfort him, but she remembered Comet's lessons. Sometimes the best way to love is to let the other learn at their own pace. A distant noise, the cry of a hawk, the crash of a branch, startled the foal. He jerked his head up, glancing back toward the open field where Comet grazed. But something unexpected happened. Black Comet had seen everything, had watched his charge approach the human. He could have charged, could have come between them, could have taken the foal and vanished back into the brush. Instead, he simply lifted his head, regarded Charlotte with those unblinking burning eyes, and then, after a long, tense moment, turned away. It was a signal, not just to the foal, but to Charlotte herself. A message, wordless and powerful. I see you. I don't understand you. But tonight, I choose not to fear you. For the first time, the wall between wild and human showed a crack. Charlotte exhaled, her body trembling with relief and awe. She let her hands drop to her sides, palms open. The foal lingered for another moment, then with a little toss of his head, trotted back to Comet's side. The stallion greeted him with a low nicker, brushing his nose against the foal's neck as if to say, "Well done, little one. You came back." As the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the clouds in fire and rose, Charlotte finally let herself cry. She pressed her hands to her face and wept, not from sadness, but from something older and deeper, the kind of feeling that comes when you realize you have crossed a threshold and can never return unchanged. When she finally looked up, darkness had crept into every corner of the landscape. Comet and the foal stood outlined against the sky, statuesque and silent. Charlotte gathered her things, careful to leave no trace, and slipped away into the brush, her mind racing with thoughts she could barely put into words. The line she had walked for so long, between her duty as a ranger and her growing empathy for these wild creatures, had shifted beneath her feet. That night, as she lay beneath the cold stars, Charlotte turned the day's memory over and over in her mind. She thought of the foal's trust, so freely given, and Comet's wary acceptance. She wondered if, in some way, she had finally been granted permission to belong here, not as a conqueror or a captor, but as a witness, maybe even an ally. Sleep came slowly. Each time Charlotte closed her eyes, she saw the foal's gaze, wide and honest, and felt the gentle brush of his tongue against her boot. She heard the subtle snort of Comet, the ancient heartbeat of the wild echoing through the night. Before dawn, Charlotte rose and crept to the edge of her hiding spot. She saw the foal nestled close to Comet, both sleeping in the soft, shifting moonlight. She felt a warmth rise in her chest, an unexpected, almost painful hope. For the first time since taking the assignment, Charlotte knew with absolute certainty that she would do anything to protect these two. Her old life, her orders, the expectations of her superiors, all of it faded beneath the weight of this quiet, irrefutable connection. She belonged, if only for a moment, to the world she had come to watch. As the sky turned from indigo to gold, Charlotte whispered a silent promise to the sleeping Mustangs. Whatever happened next, she would stand with them, no matter the cost. The Nevada air hung heavy and restless. After the quiet beauty of the past days, Charlotte sensed a subtle tension shifting across the range, an uneasiness that made even the wind seem sharp. The animals felt it too. Black Comet moved with an extra wariness, head raised often, muscles tensed at the smallest sound. The foal stayed closer to his side, less daring, shadows in his wide eyes. In the wild, safety was always temporary. Charlotte was crouched among a stand of greasewood, sketching notes in her battered journal. When she heard it, the distant, unmistakable whine of an ATV engine, it was far off, but cutting through the silence in a way nothing natural ever could. Her heart pounded in her chest. She knew immediately someone had found her disabled GPS tracker. The agency was coming. She ducked lower, the world narrowing to a single point of dread. Through her binoculars, she saw the dust plume first, then the glint of sun on metal, figures in ranger vests moving in formation. There were 3 ATVs, loaded down with ropes, tranquilizer rifles, and men who knew how to round up wild mustangs. It was the capture team, called in whenever a rogue animal or a missing ranger needed to be brought in. Panic spiked through Charlotte, raw and electric. She fumbled for her own radio, but remembered with a sinking stomach that she had turned it off days ago, deliberately silencing her only link to headquarters. Now, as the team advanced, she realized just how exposed she was, not only as an observer who had abandoned her assignment, but as a protector standing between 2 wild souls in the full force of her own agency. She could see Black Comet and the foal further up the draw, silhouetted by the slanting afternoon sun. Comet's head jerked toward the approaching noise, nostrils flaring. Instinct, honed by years of survival, told him something was wrong. With a warning snort, he nudged the foal, pushing him into a run, deeper into the folds of the canyon. The rangers were closing in fast, radios crackling, boots stomping over the rough earth. Charlotte scrambled from her cover, waving her arms, desperate to intercept them before disaster struck. "Wait!" she shouted, voice ragged and panicked. "Don't go in! You'll spook the herd!" But the leader, a grizzled senior agent named Mackenzie, barely spared her a glance. "You're out of line, Monroe," he barked, gesturing to his team. "Step back. We'll handle this." The others fanned out, tranquilizer darts loaded, ropes at the ready. Charlotte's world spun. Everything she'd witnessed, Comet's quiet heroism, the foal's hard-earned trust, now hung by a thread. She chased after them, dodging between ATVs, shouting warnings. But protocol ruled here, not compassion. The team advanced with the efficiency of those who had done this 100 times, engines roaring, boots crushing the delicate crust of sage and wildflower. Black Comet led the foal and the scattering mustangs through a maze of gullies, the foal stumbling as he tried to keep up. Charlotte darted alongside, heart hammering, pleading with the rangers to slow down, to see what she saw. A story bigger than any one mission, a family not of blood, but of choice. Suddenly, chaos erupted. In the panic, the foal darted away from Comet, blinded by terror, and crashed into a patch of tangled underbrush. Before Charlotte or Comet could react, a hidden wire snare, a remnant of an old illegal trap, snapped around the foal's leg. The baby went down hard, a high, anguished cry ripping through the canyon. Charlotte's mind blanked with horror. She saw the rangers moving in, shouting for nets, raising their rifles. Comet skidded to a halt, torn between fleeing and fighting, eyes rolling white. Charlotte, driven by a force beyond training or fear, sprinted to the foal. "Get away!" Mackenzie shouted. "He's just a wild—" But Charlotte was already there, skidding to her knees beside the struggling colt. Blood welled around the snare. The foal thrashed, wide-eyed with terror. "It's okay," she whispered, voice trembling as she fumbled for her knife. "It's okay, little guy. I've got you." She sawed through the wire, the metal biting into her palms, sweat and tears blurring her vision. Behind her, shouts and confusion. A dart whizzed past, barely missing Comet, who reared up and charged in a desperate effort to protect the foal. Charlotte cut the last strand, yanked the wire free, and scooped the foal into her arms. He was heavy, all legs and panic, but she lifted him, cradling his trembling body as if he were her own child. Everything slowed. Charlotte met Comet's wild gaze. Something passed between them. Gratitude, fear, acknowledgement. She staggered away from the confusion, shielding the foal with her own body as Comet circled protectively. The rangers hesitated, shocked by the ferocity in her face, the blood on her hands, the blatant defiance of her actions. Mackenzie stepped forward, lowering his rifle. "Monroe, what are you doing?" he demanded, anger and disbelief warring in his voice. "You're out of your mind." Charlotte stood tall, the foal pressed against her chest. Her voice was raw, but steady. "I'm not abandoning him. I won't let you take them. They're not just animals, Mackenzie. You didn't see what I saw." He shook his head, disbelief carved into every wrinkle of his face. "That's not your call." "No," Charlotte said quietly, "but it's the right one." For a moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the foal's ragged breathing, the distant calls of frightened mustangs, and the pounding of Charlotte's heart. Then, slowly, she set the foal down. Comet stepped forward, his massive body blocking the ranger's line of sight, snorting, stamping, challenging anyone to come closer. Charlotte turned, facing her team one last time. She knew what she'd sacrificed: her job, her career, maybe her future. But as she watched Comet nudge the foal to his feet, watched the two slip back into the wild, she knew she'd chosen correctly. The rangers stood frozen, unsure how to proceed, their protocol shattered by something they couldn't understand. For Charlotte, it was the end of one life, in the beginning of another, forever changed by the wild's raw, relentless grace. Evening fell like a curtain of bruised velvet over the Nevada highlands, pressing down the heat and chasing the light into pockets of deepening shadow. The confrontation with the rangers had left Charlotte shaken. Her hands still tingled from the wire snare, her heart bruised by the memory of the foal's cries. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to find a road out, but something deeper, older, kept her anchored in the wild. She trailed at a distance as Black Comet led the foal away from the chaos, the Mustang's movements urgent, purposeful. The land, too, seemed to sense a change in the air. Birds flew low, the wind twisted cold and erratic, carrying with it a warning Charlotte felt down to her bones. As the last gold faded from the sky, the first growl of thunder rolled in from the west, echoing through the ravines. Lightning splintered the horizon, painting the world in ghostly flashes. The storm was coming, fast, fierce, the kind that turned dry gullies into rivers and ancient trails into traps. Black Comet lifted his head, nostrils wide, reading the air with a wisdom that came from surviving 1,000 such nights. He nudged the foal into a trot, heading for higher ground, but Charlotte saw the subtle limp in the stallion's right foreleg. A wound reopened, blood matting the dark hair just above the hoof. The day's chaos had taken its toll, but there was no time for rest. Charlotte pulled her battered jacket tight, her ranger training warring with raw, animal fear. She checked her pack. Half a canteen of water, a few power bars, the dull ache of exhaustion in her limbs. There would be no sleep tonight. Her every sense sharpened to the flicker of lightning, the tang of ozone in the air, the panicked scurry of smaller animals seeking shelter. The storm struck without warning, a violent squall of wind that sent sand and grit stinging against her skin. The temperature plummeted and rain fell in sheets, instantly soaking Charlotte through. Visibility dropped to a few feet. In the chaos, she almost lost sight of Comet and the foal, their forms barely visible as dark blurs against the paler rock. A flash flood roared through the lowest draw, muddy water churning with debris. Charlotte ran, lungs burning, boots slipping on slick stone as she tried to keep up. She saw the foal panic, his legs churning uselessly as he struggled against the current. Comet, limping badly, braved the surge. He planted himself downstream, his body a shield, urging the foal to cross. Charlotte knew she should stay back, but something primal took over. She waded in, the icy water biting at her knees, then her waist, grabbing the foal's sodden mane and guiding him with desperate strength toward the far bank. For a terrifying moment, she lost her footing, the water threatening to sweep her and the foal away. Comet turned, eyes wide with alarm, and lunged forward, teeth bared, pressing his massive body between Charlotte and the worst of the current. Together, with the stallion's help, she found purchase on a jutting rock and heaved the foal up onto safer ground. They collapsed together, beneath a stand of twisted piñón, rain hammering the earth around them. Charlotte's fingers were numb, her clothes plastered to her skin. The foal shivered violently, sides heaving, eyes wild with terror. Comet stood over them, breathing hard, blood streaking his injured leg, but he did not falter. He faced the wind, his body broad and defiant, and dared the storm to do its worst. For a time, there was nothing but the howl of wind, the white roar of water, and the smell of wet earth. Charlotte huddled close to the foal, feeling his tremors through her soaked jacket. Instinctively, she wrapped her arms around his slender neck, murmuring nonsense words, anything to steady him. He pressed closer, mistaking her for his mother in his terror and exhaustion. Something inside Charlotte broke and mended all at once. She let herself lean into the foal's warmth, tears mingling with rain. She was no longer ranger and animal, just two souls, battered and scared, surviving the night together. When the storm's rage finally ebbed, the world was transformed. The air was sharp with the clean promise of rain, every plant shining, rocks slick and new. The worst of the water had drained away, but the ground was treacherous, scattered with debris. Comet limped painfully, pausing often to test his weight, but refused to rest until the foal and Charlotte were well away from danger. Charlotte searched her bag for a field bandage, managing to approach Comet slowly, speaking in low, steady tones. "Let me help you, big guy," she murmured, kneeling by his injured leg. Comet's ears flicked, but he did not back away. In the hush of post-storm calm, Charlotte cleaned the wound as best she could, wrapping it tight, her hands gentle but sure. The stallion's trust was hard won, a delicate bridge built on shared danger and necessity. Exhaustion crept over them. As the sky paled with the promise of dawn, Charlotte and the foal settled against the cool earth. For the first time, the foal did not flinch from her touch. Instead, he pressed his small, damp head into her lap, sighing as if all the fear in the world had drained away with the water. Comet stood guard, eyes never closing, his silhouette outlined by the thinning mist. Charlotte looked at him, this wild legend, protector, wounded and weary but unbroken, and felt a deep gratitude she could not put into words. In that quiet, sacred space between disaster and mourning, Charlotte realized the storm had tested more than just their bodies. It had burned away the old boundaries, human and wild, ranger and mustang, protector and protected. Now, in the aftermath, they were something else, a herd, if only for a night, bound by fire and survival and the stubborn refusal to give up. The world was still dangerous, the future uncertain. But for this brief, shining moment, wild and human huddled together against the cold, daring the dawn to bring whatever came next. Morning broke over the soaked Nevada highlands with a tentative gold, the world scrubbed raw and new after the storm's fury. The ground was still slick beneath Charlotte's boots as she woke, stiff and aching from sleep stolen in fragments. The foal lay curled at her side, his coat still damp, but his breathing even and peaceful. Just beyond, Black Comet stood tall in the pale light, battered but vigilant, every muscle ready to spring into motion at the first hint of danger. The landscape was changed, streams running where there had been none before, fallen branches scattered like bones. The air smelled of promise and peril, as if anything could happen on a day like this. Charlotte pulled herself up, brushed the mud from her jacket, and glanced over at Comet's bandaged leg. The wrap had held through the night, but the stallion favored it, moving with a stiff, determined limp. It was time to move. Even now, the memory of the Rangers and their relentless pursuit haunted Charlotte. She knew the wild could only grant them a temporary sanctuary. The herd they had left behind, Comet's old family, must still be somewhere nearby, drawn to the fresh grass and new water that the storm had brought. Perhaps, she dared hope, there might even be a mother among them for the orphaned foal. Black Comet seemed to sense the same need. He turned to the foal, nudging him awake, and with a low nicker, started across the wet plain. The foal followed close, clumsy but stronger now, emboldened by the night's survival. Charlotte kept her distance, a silent guardian trailing in their wake, feeling both an intruder and a protector, her place in this story shifting with every step. They found the herd grazing at the edge of a shallow lake, drawn by the shimmering promise of water. Dozens of wild mustangs moved together in loose formation, coats gleaming in the morning sun. Mares watched over their foals, young stallions sparred playfully at the periphery, while an old lead stallion, his chestnut coat scarred by many seasons, stood sentinel atop a low rise. As Comet and the orphan approached, the herd's mood changed. Heads lifted, ears pinned, nostrils flared with suspicion. The lead stallion let out a warning call, his body language rigid and aggressive. Charlotte, watching from behind a clump of willows, felt her throat tighten. This was not a family reunion. This was a test. Comet slowed, signaling the foal to wait, then stepped forward alone. His limp was clear, but his posture was proud, defiant. The lead stallion met him halfway, their bodies tense, necks arched. For a moment, the two mustangs stood nose to nose, the history of old battles and grudges hanging heavy in the air. Then the attack came. Swift, brutal, silent as thunder. The chestnut drove at Comet with bared teeth, shouldering him aside, biting at his injured leg. Comet staggered but did not yield, circling to shield the foal from the worst of the assault. Dust rose as hooves struck earth. The herd watched, restless, a tide of instinctual judgment passing through them. Charlotte's heart ached for Comet. He had risked everything for a foal that was not his own, carried him through fire and flood, only to be rejected by those who should have welcomed him home. The lead stallion snapped again, driving Comet and the foal toward the margins. Even some of the mares turned away, wary of the half-blood orphan, an outsider in their eyes. But then, as the confrontation eased and the chestnut returned to his post, something remarkable happened. A pair of yearlings, not yet burdened by the codes of dominance and purity, approached the foal. One, a tall, curious filly, bumped his nose gently. Another, a shy colt with a star-shaped blaze, nuzzled his flank in invitation to play. The foal's fear gave way to hope. He stepped toward them, hesitant at first, then more boldly as they circled him, whickering soft greetings. Comet stood back, watching, pride and uncertainty warring in his eyes. The foal glanced at him, uncertain, seeking permission. Comet lowered his head in silent blessing, stepping aside for the first time, letting the little one make his own choice. Charlotte watched it all, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She saw in Comet's posture a father's pain, the ache of loving enough to let go, of trusting that the world would be kinder this time. She saw in the foal's hesitant steps the beginning of a new life, fragile but possible. The older mustangs still kept their distance, but the younger horses formed a loose circle around the foal, drawing him into their games, their pecking order, their language. It was not perfect acceptance, but it was a start. Comet lingered at the edge of the herd, neither fully welcomed nor entirely banished. For a long while, he watched the foal, his foal, for all the world might say otherwise, run with the others. From a distance, Charlotte let herself exhale. She understood now. Protection wasn't always about fighting the world for someone. Sometimes it was about stepping back, trusting that your love had been enough to give them a chance. When the sun was high and the foal was rolling in the grass with his new friends, Charlotte found a quiet place beneath a cottonwood. She wrote in her notebook, her hand trembling as she put the lesson into words. Love is letting go, even when every part of you wants to hold on. That night, as the herd moved off into the moonlight, Comet followed at a distance, his limp less pronounced. Charlotte trailed behind, her presence felt but no longer feared. She had crossed her own threshold, no longer just a ranger, but a witness to something more. In the darkness, the foal paused to look back at her, then at Comet. For a moment, three worlds, the wild, the human, and the fragile space in between, came together in perfect, hopeful balance. A week passed, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the range seemed calm. The storm-washed grasses were green and thick. The herd had accepted the orphan foal in their own way, and Black Comet, though still limping, was part of their shifting constellation. Charlotte kept her distance, but watched every sunrise. with a kind of reverence, her heart learning a new rhythm, one that beat for the land and the lives it sheltered. But peace in the wild was a fragile thing. It never lasted, not when men saw opportunity in what was untamed. The rumors came first, ranch hands in town whispering of private hunters, men with trucks and lariats, men who saw wild horses as dollar signs and trophies. Charlotte overheard them at the only diner in town when she ventured in for supplies. She recognized the greed in their eyes and the way their voices dropped when she walked past. "That black Mustang, he's worth a fortune to the right buyer," one said, eyes flicking to her with challenge. "No law is going to stop us this time." The next morning, Charlotte returned to the edge of the herd's territory, unease curling in her gut. She scouted the hills, binoculars sweeping the horizon. The world felt too still, the air pressed tight with a coming storm of a different kind. That's when she saw the glint. Sunlight off a windshield, a column of dust trailing up the distant track. Private hunters. She could see 3 trucks, open beds bristling with ropes, tranquilizer guns, and rifles. Not government men. These were hired hands, paid to catch, subdue, and sell. Her body moved before her mind caught up. She ran, boots thudding on hard earth, lungs burning, toward the shallow draw where the herd was grazing. She shouted as she went, her voice ragged with urgency. "Comet! Move! Get them out!" But the herd, spooked by her sudden appearance, milled in confusion. The foal was with the younger horses, all wide-eyed and nervous. Comet's ears pricked, sensing danger. The trucks drew closer, engines snarling as they split across the plain, trying to box the horses in. Charlotte had seconds to decide. She dropped her pack, yanked the tranquilizer rifle from its sling, and sprinted out in front of the herd, between the hunters and the wild. The lead truck skidded to a stop barely 20 feet away, and a man with a broad hat and cruel eyes jumped down, swinging a lasso. He pointed the rifle at her. "Step aside, lady. These horses ain't government property. You got no badge here." Charlotte stood her ground, legs shaking but jaw set. "You're trespassing on protected land," she shouted, even though she knew how little the law mattered this far from the ranger station. "Leave now. You're not taking them." A second hunter laughed, spitting in the dust. "That black stallion's worth more than your whole salary. You really gonna die on this hill?" Charlotte leveled her rifle, then with a slow, deliberate motion, tossed it into the dirt between them. "I'm not here to shoot anyone," she said. "But I'm not moving, either." Behind her, the mustangs gathered, nervous but watching. Black Comet snorted, pawing the ground, eyes blazing. The foal, tucked in the center of the young horses, trembled but stood his ground. The tension was a living thing, hot, crackling, about to snap. The lead hunter made a move for his gun. Charlotte stepped forward, voice low and fierce. "You want them? You'll have to go through me." Something in her tone, or maybe in the absolute certainty of her stance, gave the men pause. The second hunter hesitated, eyes darting to the rest of the group. "She's bluffing," he muttered. "She can't stop us." But then, the wild itself answered. Black Comet charged forward, dust exploding beneath his hooves. He reared, mane wild, teeth bared, a force of nature in flesh and blood. The rest of the herd surged behind him, forming a circle, their bodies a living shield around the foal and the young. Charlotte could feel the thunder of their hooves in her bones. The hunters faltered, stumbling backward at the raw defiance before them. The lead man cursed, trying to swing his rope, but Comet snapped at the air, coming so close the man had to dive back into his truck. Horses filled the space between Charlotte and the hunters, unified by something deeper than instinct, a shared will not to be broken. The two worlds collided, men with guns and ropes, faces twisted with greed, and the herd, wild and proud, defending their own. But in the standoff, it was not violence or weapons that won. It was the unbreakable unity of the Mustangs and the lone, unarmed woman who refused to step aside. After a breathless minute, the hunters broke. The lead truck spun its wheels, spraying gravel. One of the men yelled, "Ain't worth it, let's go." And, one by one, the trucks pulled back, dust clouds trailing as they retreated into the hills. The wild was quiet again. Charlotte stood alone for a moment, shaking, tears stinging her eyes. Comet trotted up, nostrils flared, stopping a few feet away. The foal pressed close to the other young horses, safe in their circle. Charlotte bent, picking up her discarded rifle, feeling every ache in her body and every bruise in her heart. She turned to the herd, to Comet and the foal. "It's over. You're safe now. I promise." But even as she said it, she knew the wild would always be full of dangers. She could not protect them from everything. But for now, for this morning, they had won. Not through violence or authority, but through unity, will, and the courage to stand between what's right and what's easy. As the herd moved away, melting back into the open land, Comet paused, looking back at her. In acknowledgement, a final spark of trust between worlds. Charlotte watched them go, tears on her cheeks, grateful for the wild's lesson, that sometimes the greatest power is simply refusing to let anyone break what you love. The Nevada wind swept away the dust, and the mountains glowed beneath the high sun. Charlotte stood tall in the empty plain, her shadow long behind her. The battle was over, but the story of the wild and the love that binds it would go on. The sun set slow and golden across the Nevada basin, painting the world with a quiet glory that made even the battered, scarred landscape look gentle. The herd moved in the distance, a living river of color flowing across the hills, their forms outlined against the fading light. For the first time since she'd taken this assignment, Charlotte didn't reach for her notebook or camera. Instead, she sat cross-legged atop a stony rise, hands resting in her lap, watching Black Comet and the foal disappear into the coming dark. It was over, at least, this chapter. The hunters were gone, their dust long settled. The rangers, too, had retreated, stung by Charlotte's open defiance, and left to puzzle over her decision. Headquarters had called 3 times, then stopped. There would be consequences, she knew, but for now, all she felt was a profound, exhausted peace. As the sky faded from indigo to starlit black, Charlotte built a small fire and wrapped herself in her battered jacket. Alone in the vastness, she turned over every lesson the wild had taught her. The world she'd entered months ago felt so far away, one of rules, radio checks, paperwork, and rigid lines between right and wrong. But here, under the stars, the truth was simpler and much, much harder. She thought about Black Comet, the stallion whose legend had haunted the valleys for years. He was supposed to be dangerous, unpredictable, wild, but she had seen him act not out of instinct, but out of a choice more honest than anything she'd witnessed in a courtroom or an office. He had protected a foal with no blood tie. He'd risked himself, then let the little one go, not because it was easy, but because it was right. It struck her then, the core truth of all she had witnessed. The wild was not lawless. It simply obeyed a different code, a set of values and rules as real and unbreakable as anything written by humans. She remembered the way Comet had faced the wolves, the way the herd had closed ranks against the hunters, the way the foal had been allowed to fail, fall, and try again. There was a dignity to it all, a fierce, unspoken honor. As the fire crackled, Charlotte took out her phone and began to type. Not to headquarters this time, but to herself, to whatever future audience might one day care about what she had seen. Her words spilled out, clear and sure, the way they always did when she finally understood what mattered. We were wrong to think the wild is chaos. It's not. It's a code. Just one we never bothered to understand. Black Comet didn't save that foal because he had to. He saved him because he chose to. That's more human than most of us ever act. She wrote about the day the foal approached her in trust, the night they all survived the storm, the morning she had stood between the herd and the hunters with nothing but her will. She wrote about how she'd come to the desert to study the wild, but had instead been changed by it, forced to confront the brittle places in her own heart, to let go of control and open herself to uncertainty, loss, and grace. By morning, Charlotte had made her decision. She packed her things, left her badge and field gear in a neat pile for the next ranger who might pass through, and hiked out of the canyons for the last time. The town looked different in daylight, smaller, quieter, full of ordinary people who would never know how close their world had come to losing something extraordinary. She sent her article to the nation's biggest conservation journal, hit submit, and waited for the world to judge her the way the herd had judged Comet and the Foal. Not for her blood, but for her choices. Weeks later, she stood on the edge of a mountain trail, clipboard in hand, surrounded by a dozen wide-eyed kids from the local elementary school. She pointed to a set of fresh hoof prints, the marks pressed deep in the soft earth, and told them the story of a stallion who had no obligation to be a father, and yet chose to be one anyway. She described how the wild horses lived, how they protected, taught, and sometimes let go, not because they were savage, but because they understood something we too often forget. That family is not about blood, but about who stands with you when the world falls apart. The kids hung on every word. Some asked if she missed being a ranger, if she was sorry for what she'd lost. Charlotte smiled, an honest, weary smile that came from the deepest part of her. Sometimes you have to stop asking what the rules say, she answered, and start listening to what your heart knows. The wild taught me that. After the lesson, she led them back down the trail. As they walked, a sudden wind kicked up, carrying the sound of distant hoofbeats, a reminder that the wild was still out there, living by its own code, untouched by fences or fear. Charlotte paused, looking out over the rolling expanse, and sent a silent wish to Comet and the Foal, wherever they roamed. Be safe. Run free. Remember that you are not alone. That night, in the quiet of her small house, Charlotte received an email from the Conservation Journal. Her article had been accepted. Her words would reach thousands. The final line echoed through her mind as she read it, a lesson for anyone willing to listen. Doing the right thing, even when you don't have to. That's the highest law the wild ever taught me. She closed her eyes, breathed in the memory of sage and storm, and smiled. There are some stories that don't end when the last hoofprint fades or the final danger passes. They linger, in the quiet, in the places between heartbeats, shaping the way you see the world and the way you see yourself. That's how it was for me, long after I left the Nevada highlands, long after Black Comet and the Foal had disappeared into the golden grass. People sometimes ask what I really learned out there, alone in the wild. Was it worth the sacrifice? Did it change me? If I'm honest, it changed everything. At first I thought my job was about rules, boundaries, and making order out of chaos. But the wild taught me something far more difficult and far more true, that what looks like chaos from the outside is actually held together by invisible threads of loyalty, courage, sacrifice, and above all, choice. Black Comet was never supposed to be a father. The Foal was not his blood. No rule, no law, no ancient instinct demanded he protect that little one. But he did. And not just once. Not just in a moment of heroism. He chose, every day, to stand between the vulnerable and the world's indifference. He didn't do it because he had to. He did it because it was right. That is the lesson that has stayed with me long after I hung up my badge. Family is not who you're born to. Family is who you choose. Again and again to fight for, especially when no one's watching. In our own lives, we so often wait for a reason, a rule, a blood tie, an obligation to do what's right. We tell ourselves it's not our business, not our job, not our place to step in. But Comet never waited for a reason. He stepped forward when it mattered, not because it was easy or expected, but because someone needed him. Watching him, I realized that true integrity, the kind that endures when storms come, when rules fall away, isn't about duty. It's about the courage to do what is right, even when you don't have to. It's about compassion that chooses action over comfort, and love that isn't limited by blood or background. The world tells us that wildness is lawless, that nature is only cruel. But that isn't what I saw. I saw a code of honor that was stronger than fear, a loyalty that endured hardship, and a willingness to let go. Not because it was painless, but because real love wants what's best for the other, even if it means stepping back. This is the message that echoes in me, and I hope it echoes in you. What makes us human isn't just who we protect, because we must, but who we choose to protect, simply because it's right. When you face your own storms, your own moments of decision, ask yourself, are you acting out of duty or out of choice? Are you waiting for someone else to lead, Or are you willing to be the one who steps up? Are you drawing lines between mine and theirs? Or are you seeing the family that forms when we choose each other in the hardest moments? I think about Comet and the Foal whenever I doubt. I remember that night in the storm when all that mattered was surviving together. I remember the courage it took for a wild stallion to stand his ground, and the humility it took for a human to put down a rifle and just listen. I remember how, in the end, love and loyalty were stronger than any threat or law. So if this story moved you, I hope you'll carry its lesson with you. Stand for those who have no one else. Protect. Not because you have to, but because you can. Love. Not just those who are yours by birth, but those you choose, over and over, even when the world isn't watching. That's the real law of the wild. And maybe, just maybe, it's what makes us most human. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched you, please like, share, and subscribe, because sometimes the wild teaches us truths that the civilized world forgets, and stories like this are meant to be shared.